I now have the great pleasure of inviting up to stage Shiva Dustdar. So come on, join us, Shiva. Shiva's the sort of new president of the EIB Institute, but Shiva also has a long and storied history, not just with this community and this conference. Good to see you, Shiva.
Yeah.
Come on, sit down.
Thank you.
I'll just pour some water. But the EIB more broadly. So Shiva, anything you want to say particularly about sort of background, to give a context about the EIB and the EIB Institute, just to help the community here understand a little bit about it?
So, I hope you have all heard of the Bank of the European Union, the EU Climate Bank, which indeed was created to finance the integration of Europe. So if you have landed at the London City Airport, taken the DLR to Canary Wharf, well, Canary Wharf, we were the first lender, then the DLR, we financed the Northern Line extension. So pretty much anything, you know, from turning the tap water to the lights. The UK was one of the biggest beneficiaries of EIB funding for those in the UK. But anyway, the EIB has, of course, therefore, a number of financing programs. Many of you probably know our subsidiary, the EIF. I hope you've heard of them. That's the largest European fund investor. We also have EIB Global, which invests outside of the European Union. And then there's the EIB Institute. And the Institute is the part of the EIB family. What I would say usually is the money you get from the Institute, you don't have to repay. So that makes me usually very popular with those who are looking for either grant funding or other types of support. The Institute's primary responsibilities are actually to support the bank's wider initiatives on innovation, climate, and development through relations with universities, social entrepreneurs in general. So we kind of do the additional upstream, I would say, activities that hopefully then develop the European ecosystem or also the global ecosystem in those areas of innovation, climate, and development. So that's us.
It's great to have you here.
Great to be here after
it's nice to have you back.
COVID, you know, being back in person and in action with the superstar, Jim Mawson.
Well, it's the other way around, Shiva. But maybe if I could pick up that point, a little bit of the history. Not many people necessarily know about the great work that the EIB has done. But Europe more broadly, about 75–80% of the attendees here at the Symposium are outside of the UK and Europe in some ways. And so how do you think that Europe has changed in your sort of time? What do you think the sort of mindset is now when you think about innovation and growth from a European point of view?
I think a pivotal moment was around 2005, 2006, when the European Commission decided that instead of only giving support through grants, that we should actually look at getting a higher multiplier and leverage effect by putting some of the grants as capital and giving it to the EIB family, so EIB, EIF, for risk sharing, to basically be able to take more risk, come in earlier, and develop a whole range of financial instruments that are in debt and equity. And I think this has been a pivotal moment. So one, I would say, therefore, the role of the public finance institutions, not just the EIB, EIF, but if you look in each of the European Union countries, or many of them, you have these large, the KfWs, the BPI France, big important players that are really supporting the development of the innovation ecosystem with these high risk-bearing interventions. The second point is we also realize how it's not enough to just put money to work. We need to also add additional advisory functions, and that actually, and that was something that I was also very much involved in on the EIB side, developing our innovation finance advisory capabilities, because very often entrepreneurs don't even first know that there's all this public sector funding. I mean, many of you probably sitting here thinking, what is she talking about? I've never heard of this. Well, many of the entrepreneurs wouldn't know either. Two, if they know that there are some tools or some sources, first of all, they may be quite confused how to even get to the money, or it may be extremely cumbersome. It may take too long. So for all of these purposes, the advisory support schemes that exist either at the EU level or at the national levels can be quite useful. And then the third point I would make is what has also happened, and this is where the next speaker probably will come in, is that the European Commission has also really responded to the needs of, or the market failure, so to speak, of many deep tech companies in Europe not getting early enough patient capital to scale up. And and hence has developed this European Innovation Council flagship instrument. Now, I know it's still in its early days, and of course, with all of these initiatives, they sometimes take a while to really become as successful as the initial idea is. But I think all of these initiatives together, combined, are really helping the ecosystem to develop. And I would say maybe the last point is on the EIF, because that's where the space for you all is. Given that the boundaries of what is now venture capital and corporate venture capital, and given how you are also all coming in to this space more joined up, the EIF is probably I would say is going to be increasingly an important player also in the corporate venture space. And I would therefore say, looking at it from the private sector, think of these instruments as risk sharing, multiplier, giving an additional, perspective, scrutiny to the investments that you want to make, with a perhaps different angle than just profit maximization. And that's where we hopefully add the value.
I mean, you talked about that sort of leverage effect or multiplier effect. How many sort of billions has been put in, and what's actually required? Do you reckon it's trillions of dollars to kind of fully realize the potential here in Europe?
Well, I mean, it's hard to know what we're talking definitely a few trillions, and I'm referring to also some of the recent reports that I've seen by Atomico and so on. There's clearly, we are in the space in Europe on the trillions when it comes to the valuations collectively of this sector, but the support from a public sector is more in the billions. And I would say the multiplier effect, if you look across our various financial instruments, and they vary, of course, equity versus debt has a different leverage effect, but I would say on average 5 times. So for every euro, certainly the EIF is generally putting into an indirect towards a risk sharing towards a bank or to a fund, you typically get 5 euros of investments in ultimate beneficiaries. So that is, and this is why it is so important to see this pivotal moment of grants to financial instruments, because before, and still to this day, of course, grants are an important part of supporting innovation, but you only, once that money's out, it's out, whereas you can actually get much more effect by putting it through these instruments.
It's cool, but you talk about the sort of, the fact that you've got these states and then other investors coming in. Is there any sort of thinking about the sort of diversity, of corporates, or, from sort of a gender perspective, or in terms of what you're trying to achieve to unlock that potential? Because if everyone has the same financial mindset or the same sort of approach to what they're looking for, presumably that won't sort of deliver the sorts of goals that you're expecting.
Yes, I mean, now I guess we're coming to one of our favorite topics, and I have to thank Jim for actually a lot of. I think you're one of the, I would say, trailblazers when it comes to diversity and gender smart investing, and I think a lot of the initiatives that you are doing are really bearing fruit. I would say from an EU policy perspective, clearly we are, I think the day we are at this stage, and it's interesting to see how we are developing, we are now starting to really bring much more focus to a gender lens, but we are still in the early days in doing so through the financial instruments. But you will already, see that in a lot of the due diligence that the EIB itself makes for its direct investments, and also the EIF for investments in funds. They will be looking at the team composition. They will be increasingly looking at actually the investments where there's a gender lens. And the reason behind it is, I think we increasingly all realize through the data that is coming out of so many studies that unless you actually bring that mindset, that gender lens into your investments, you are never going to realize the full potential that you have. And I think this is, I would say, I was listening to a podcast, which I highly recommend, by Jenny Kenny on a book, Innovation Mindsets. And given, for all of us who are interested in innovation, I mean, she has shown how important it is, not just from a social justice perspective, but really from a hardcore investment perspective, to look at diversity of opinions and the skill sets that diverse teams bring. And I think, we all certainly want to benefit. And I think from a European perspective, I mean, half of the population, of the European Union is women. So we're not talking of a minority. We really need to bring that to bear.
Yeah, it's such an important piece. But there's also that globalization. I think you've recently returned from, with some of the European Commission folks from a tour to the US. How do you think about that global partnership? Again, I'm mindful that here we've probably got maybe $4 or $5 trillion of aggregate revenue from the corporates of 10, many from the US, Asia, other countries as well. So what do you think you could bring to that ecosystems or their ecosystems, and vice versa? What would you want from them?
Yeah, I think this is a really great example of how the market has evolved. I would say 10, 15 years ago, I would have been sitting here saying, and many of us would have been sitting here, we are looking at Silicon Valley because that's where we get the inspiration, and they have nailed it, and we are just trying to figure out how to bring in a Silicon Valley perspective into the European Union. Now, I think over the last 10 years, we have realized that you can't just, there's no pill to just bring it, and also turn Europe into Silicon Valley. But I think we have, the data shows that the European innovation ecosystem has matured. It actually has become more resilient if you look at also how it has fared in the current downturn versus the prior downturns. So there's a lot of development. And I think now the conversations, and referring to those trips that we have recently had to Silicon Valley, are of course of learning and mutual learning. But I would say mutual is definitely the key word, because we had some very interesting meetings with investors in the US who are actually, first of all, telling us that they are always open to look at investment opportunities in Europe. I think, we still, even though there's the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, Europe, I would say, is leading on climate technologies and the regulation, everything around it. It's something that is fragile and we need to keep at it. But there are great investment opportunities, and I hope that those of you in the room who are investing in those can tell the others about those opportunities. So there is definitely more of a partnership approach. I would say even on gender, we had some very interesting meetings, thanks to introductions by Jim, of women in Silicon Valley saying, we want to join forces with the women in venture capital in Europe, because we actually believe that they may actually be further, it's even tougher here than in Europe, which it was hard for us to believe that they actually would say that. But I think, so meaning that when it comes to that purpose-driven, social, more inclusive approach, bringing those elements into the financing, I would say that's where we can learn from each other, and that's what we are hoping to do, much more interaction. And I would say for Asia, we're probably not there yet, and that's maybe the next thing.
Happy to help if you need anything on that front, Shiva. And then finally, you talk about a lot of capital. Obviously, entrepreneurs, first point, I think I referenced an entrepreneur, she's looking for capital, but customers, product development, hiring, and an exit. That 5 things in totality, corporates are very good at. What is the EIB and the Institute doing as you think about more support to the entrepreneurs that you work with, or how you could sort of collaborate with some of the corporates here in that regard?
Yeah, so this is actually a new initiative that we're literally putting in place, so it's still in its works, but a very exciting one. So I mentioned the European Innovation Council, and you'll hear more about what that is about, but it gives grants, and it has also an equity sort of investment vehicle. What has happened is you have this bulging grant portfolio of research projects or early stage startups that are not eligible, they're not mature enough to actually, or they're not even startups to get the equity. And what we are, even though in Europe we are, you may hear the thing that we don't have a startup problem. I think we still don't get enough of these researchers to actually make that jump into setting up companies. And what we are now looking at is setting up what is a very known, proven approach to executive in residence program in the US, and bring a similar approach to the European Union, to this at the early stage as a pilot to those grant beneficiaries, researchers who are trying to figure out whether, is that the right next thing, but also bring a bit of a market perspective. Instead of just going out to the research and saying, who would like some mentoring from a senior executives, bring actually those senior executives to pull the research where they see a market product fit. This is one of the takeaways from Silicon Valley, where we just were told how symbiotic that relationship between a venture capitalist and a faculty at one of these top universities is. And we're trying to see how could we, in Europe, adapt it to our needs, which is obviously we don't have maybe the same setup. So that's one key thing, to give therefore these this very targeted mentoring support, matching them up. And the other thing is to actually develop a culture of giving back by the executives who have made it, who have either founded several companies and so on, to give back to the next generation. It's something, I don't want to say we don't have it in Europe, but maybe we haven't created the right channels for that type of thing, and this is what we're experimenting. So what I would like to just leave as a point to you, if any of you in the audience would like to be part of such a pilot scheme as a mentor, please come out. I'm here today and also tomorrow. We are going to soon sort of start looking for those, and I think there are a lot of potential candidates in the room.
Definitely, and I should give a little mention to Thierry, if you want to wave. Thierry's editor of Global University Ventures, so that collaboration between the startups and spin-outs and faculty and students, and on that side of things, connecting with the capital and the people who provide that support is really good. So it's wonderful to hear about the EI initiative, but it's also wonderful to hear from you, Shiva. So thank you more broadly. Please join me.
Thank you.